History is a story we are told. A sequence of events, agreed upon and taught as fact. We are told that the 19th century was an age of invention, of progress, of empires built on steam and steel. It was also, we are told, an age of hardship. A time of poverty and disease, the unfortunate but necessary byproducts of the Industrial Revolution. This hardship, the story goes, created orphans. A great many of them. They are a sad footnote in the grand narrative of progress. But what if they are not the footnote? What if they are the headline? The official account asks us to believe that social disruption led to millions of children being left without parents, filling vast institutions and boarding westbound trains to new lives. It is a simple, tragic explanation. And it is a mathematical impossibility. The numbers do not support the narrative. In fact, they actively contradict it. When you calculate the level of adult mortality required to produce such a staggering number of orphans, you arrive at a figure that surpasses any recorded war, famine, or plague of the era. This is not a theory. This is an accounting problem. We are going to examine the evidence that history has chosen to ignore, the photographs, the infrastructure, and the raw, unblinking data. We will demonstrate that the orphan crisis of the 19th century is not the result of industrial growing pains, but the demographic echo of a silent, unrecorded cataclysm. The story we have been told is broken. And the children are the proof. Our investigation begins with the visible record. The images left behind from this period are unsettling, not just for their content, but for their sheer volume and consistency. Search for photographs from the mid to late 19th century, and you will inevitably find them. The children. They are posed in sterile, rigid lines in front of enormous, imposing buildings. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of them, all dressed in ill-fitting, uniform clothing. Their faces are often blank, their eyes hollow. They are not captured in moments of play or childhood innocence. They are presented as specimens, as inventory. Look closer at these photographs. Notice the scale of the institutions. These are not small, local poorhouses. They are vast, multi-story brick and stone fortresses, built with an industrial sense of purpose. Foundling hospitals in New York, London, Paris, they all share a common architectural language of mass containment. Why was such monumental infrastructure required for what history portrays as a background social issue? These buildings were not temporary shelters, they were permanent, state-of-the-art facilities for processing human beings on an unprecedented scale. Then there is the phenomenon of the orphan trains. Between 1854 and 1929 in the United States alone, an estimated 250,000 children were put on trains and shipped from eastern cities to the towns and farms of the Midwest. Think of the logistics. This was not a handful of scattered church charities. This was a systematic, decades-long operation of mass relocation. The promotional materials of the time read like catalogs, advertising children for placement, complete with descriptions of their temperament and physical traits. It was a conveyor belt of humanity, moving children from a place of unknown origin to a place of unknown future. The visual evidence presents a profound contradiction. On one hand, official history treats this orphan surge as a secondary effect of industrialization. A side story. Yet the photographs, the architecture, and the sheer scale of the relocation programs suggest something else entirely. They suggest a primary crisis. A demographic emergency of the highest order, demanding a national, and even international, response. The visual record is screaming that something is wrong with the story. The scale of the solution does not match the scale of the officially stated problem. What event could possibly necessitate the creation of a continent-spanning system for the redistribution of children? Let us move beyond the images and consider the cold, hard logistics. The management of millions of parentless children represents a practical challenge so immense that it borders on the impossible for the era in question. We are asked to believe that a society lit by gas lamps and powered by horses could marshal the resources for a humanitarian effort that would strain even modern nations. Let's break it down. First, housing. The sheer number of immense orphanages and foundling homes constructed in a relatively short period, from roughly 1840 to 1890, is an architectural anomaly. These were not wooden shacks. They were massive, fire-proofed brick and stone structures, often with their own plumbing, heating, and industrial kitchens. This requires enormous capital investment, coordinated architectural planning, and a massive supply chain of materials and skilled labor. Where did this funding and expertise suddenly come from, across dozens of countries, all at once? The construction alone suggests a level of centralized priority that is not mentioned in our history books. Next, provisions. A large orphanage could house over 1,000 children. Consider the daily requirements. Feeding 1,000 children 3 meals a day requires tons of food. Milk, bread, meat, vegetables. This food had to be sourced, transported without modern refrigeration, cooked in industrial quantities, and distributed every single day. This implies a highly organized and resilient agricultural surplus and a sophisticated supply chain dedicated solely to these institutions. Now multiply that by the thousands of such institutions in operation. How did a pre-industrial society, already supposedly struggling with poverty and food security, manage to feed millions of extra, non-productive mouths? Then there is the matter of administration. To manage hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children, you need a bureaucracy. You need records. You need intake procedures, medical evaluations, classification systems, and a method for tracking each child as they move through the system, perhaps onto an orphan train. This requires a level of data management and clerical organization that we associate with the 20th century. Yet the records show that this system existed, and it functioned. It processed children with a chilling, industrial efficiency. Who trained these administrators? Who designed these systems of tracking and placement? The infrastructure appears almost fully formed, without a period of trial and error. It's as if a pre-packaged solution was deployed simultaneously across the Western world to handle a sudden, overwhelming problem. Let's frame this with a modern comparison. In the 21st century, with all our technology, communication, and logistical capabilities, managing a refugee crisis of a few 100,000 people strains international aid organizations to their breaking point. The 19th century apparently managed a crisis of millions of children for decades, using paper ledgers and the telegram. It is not just unlikely. It is a practical impossibility under the conditions we are told existed. The official narrative rests on a foundation of 3 words: poverty, disease, and industrialization. These are presented as a sufficient explanation for the millions of orphans. But when examined with any degree of scrutiny, this explanation crumbles. It is a vague, hand-waving gesture at a problem whose specifics it cannot account for. Let's start with poverty. The Industrial Revolution certainly created immense urban poverty. Families lived in squalid conditions. But poverty, historically, does not create orphans on this scale. It creates child laborers. It forces families to stick together for survival. In times of hardship, the extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, is the primary safety net. For a child to become a true orphan, to be given over to the state, requires the removal of not just the mother and father, but the entire family structure. Are we to believe that poverty systematically atomized and erased entire extended families, millions of times over, leaving only the children? This is not a known sociological pattern. Now, let us consider disease. The 19th century was rife with epidemics: cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, tuberculosis. These were terrible and deadly. But they do not fit the demographic profile required. These diseases did not selectively target adults of child-rearing age while sparing their children. In fact, diseases often hit the very young and the very old the hardest. A plague that kills parents would likely also kill their children, or at least a significant portion of them. It would not produce a vast, healthy surplus of orphans. Furthermore, a major plague leaves records. It causes panic, quarantines, mass graves, and extensive public documentation. While the epidemics of the 19th century are recorded, their documented death tolls are nowhere near high enough to account for the sheer number of parentless children. There is a massive discrepancy. Finally, we have the records themselves, or rather, the lack thereof. When you examine the intake files from these orphanages and foundling societies, a disturbing pattern emerges. The paperwork is systematically incomplete. A child's name is listed, an approximate age given. But the section for parents is often blank, or contains a single, useless word: abandoned. Where are the death certificates for the millions of parents who supposedly died of disease or workplace accidents? Where are the family records, the links to a previous life? It's as if these children did not come from families, but simply materialized at the gates of the institutions. The official explanation is a story that avoids specifics. It uses broad, General concepts like poverty to paper over a colossal hole in the historical record. It is a template, repeated in textbook after textbook, because a comfortable lie is easier than an unsettling truth. The explanation fails because it does not and cannot account for the specific, anomalous data point. Millions of children, stripped of their entire familial context, appearing all at once. If this were a purely American phenomenon, it could perhaps be dismissed as a unique consequence of the nation's rapid, chaotic expansion. But it is not. The orphan surge of the 19th century was a global event. The same visual and logistical anomalies we find in New York and Chicago are mirrored in London, Paris, Moscow, and even as far as Melbourne, Australia. This is a critical point. A synchronized, global crisis demands a synchronized, global cause. In England, the workhouse system, codified by the Poor Law of 1834, swelled with an unprecedented number of parentless children. Dr. Barnardo's Homes, founded in London in 1866, grew into a colossal network that rescued over 60,000 children, many of whom were shipped off to the far corners of the British Empire. The language used, the scale of the operation, and the time frame directly parallel the Children's Aid Society and the orphan trains in the United States. In France, the tours d'abandon or abandonment towers were institutionalized. These were rotating cupboards built into the walls of foundling hospitals where a mother could anonymously deposit an infant. The number of children passing through these systems skyrocketed in the middle of the century. In Russia, the Moscow Foundling Home, an enormous structure established earlier, saw its population explode during this same period, becoming one of the largest institutions of its kind in the world. Even in Australia, a distant colony, we see the construction of large-scale orphanages in Sydney and Melbourne in the mid to late 1800s to deal with a sudden crisis of deserted children. The pattern is the same, everywhere. First, a sudden, inexplicable rise in the number of children without parents. Second, the rapid construction of massive, state-sponsored institutions to house them. Third, the creation of systems for their relocation and redistribution, often involving long-distance travel. The architectural style of these orphanages is another piece of evidence. Despite being built in different countries by different architects, they share a common design philosophy. They are imposing, utilitarian, and built for control and efficiency. They resemble prisons or factories more than homes. It's a standardized solution applied to a standardized problem across the globe. What does this global pattern tell us? It tells us that the cause cannot be purely local. It cannot be just the American Industrial Revolution or the English Poor Laws. These were symptoms, or rather, responses. The pattern suggests a single, shared event that impacted the entire Western world simultaneously, producing the exact same demographic signature: a society suddenly awash with parentless children. The official history offers no such global event. It presents the 19th century as a collection of separate national stories. But the orphans tell a different story. They are the evidence of a shared, unwritten chapter of global history. This is the heart of the matter. The story of the past can be manipulated. Photographs can be staged, but basic arithmetic is unforgiving. And the numbers surrounding the 19th century orphan phenomenon do not add up. Let us perform a simple calculation. We will be conservative. The orphan train movement in the U.S. moved approximately 250,000 children. This was just one program. Countless other children were housed in institutions and never transported. Estimates of the total orphan population in the U.S. alone run into the millions over the course of the latter half of the century. Let's take a snapshot in time. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that in the year 1870, there were 1 million true orphans in the United States. Children with no living parents or known relatives. 1 million children implies the prior removal of at least 1 million, and up to 2 million, adults of child-rearing age. The total population of the United States in 1870 was just under 40 million. The number of adults between the ages of 20 and 45, the prime parenting years, was a fraction of that, perhaps 10 to 12 million. To produce 1 million orphans, you would need to eliminate somewhere between 8% and 20% of the entire parent population in the years leading up to 1870. This would be a demographic collapse. Let's put that in context. The American Civil War, the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, took place from 1861 to 1865. Approximately 620,000 soldiers died. It was a staggering loss of life that scarred the nation for generations. Yet, the number of adults that must be disappeared to account for the orphans is significantly larger than the total death toll of the Civil War. And these missing parents are not soldiers. They are civilians, mothers and fathers, vanishing from the record in numbers that ought to signify a cataclysm greater than the war itself. Where is the record of this event? Where are the histories of the Great Plague of the 1850s that killed millions of American parents but spared their children? They do not exist. We have detailed records of cholera outbreaks. In the worst epidemic, in 1849, an estimated 5,000 people died in New York City. This is a tragedy, but it is a statistical drop in the bucket compared to the numbers required to create the orphan crisis. The official causes, poverty, disease, accidents, simply do not provide the body count. We are presented with a balance sheet that is wildly out of order. On one side, we have millions of orphans, a demographic liability. On the other side, the historical record of parent deaths, the demographic asset that should balance the sheet, is almost empty. This is not an interpretation. It is a mathematical certainty. The children exist. The parents do not. The official explanation for their disappearance is statistically insufficient. Therefore, the official explanation must be wrong. We have established a series of facts. A visible crisis of parentless children. A massive, coordinated infrastructure to manage them. A failed official explanation. A global pattern. And a mathematical impossibility. Logic dictates that we must search for an alternative hypothesis that fits these facts. We are not interested in fantasy. We are interested in a controlled, rational explanation for an irrational gap in our history. The hypothesis is this. Sometime in the early to mid-19th century, a major, unrecorded event occurred. This event had a unique and specific demographic signature. It caused a massive number of deaths among the adult population while leaving a large number of children alive. This event was not a conventional war, as that would be recorded and would primarily kill men. It was not a conventional plague, as that would not spare children so selectively and its scale would be undeniable in the historic record. We cannot know the precise nature of the event, because its records, if they ever existed, appear to have been scrubbed. But we can deduce its characteristics from its effects. Perhaps it was a fast-acting pathogen, an airborne virus or prion, that had a drastically different effect on developed adult immune systems than it did on developing juvenile ones. Perhaps it was an environmental or atmospheric event, a series of volcanic eruptions causing global crop failures and famine that adults succumbed to first, or a change in atmospheric composition that was toxic to adults over a certain age. The exact mechanism is secondary to the outcome. The crucial point of the hypothesis is that a significant portion of the adult population was removed from the world in a relatively short period of time. What we call the Victorian era and the Gilded Age, then, is not a story of organic progress. It is the story of a civilization in recovery. A reset. The survivors, or perhaps a new group that arrived after, found a world partially emptied of its people but with its infrastructure largely intact. They were faced with a daunting task: to rebuild a society and to manage the millions of children left behind by the previous generation. This hypothesis elegantly explains all our anomalies. It explains the sudden appearance of millions of orphans. It explains the urgent, almost panicked construction of a global infrastructure to house and process them. It explains why these children had no records of their parents. Their parents were victims of an event that was not to be recorded. It explains the empty, hollow look in the children's eyes. They were survivors of a profound trauma that the New World had no words for. The orphanages were not just charities, they were processing centers for the remnants of a lost world. The orphan trains were not just a social program. They were a necessary tool of repopulation, seeding the empty landscape with a new generation that had no memory of, and no connection to, whatever came before. We are left with a profound and unsettling conclusion. The story of our recent past has a hole in it. A vast, child-sized hole. We have demonstrated that the visual record, the logistical realities, and the cold, hard numbers of the 19th century orphan crisis do not align with the simple story we have been told. The official explanation of poverty and disease is not a sufficient cause for the observed effect. The scale is wrong. The demographic signature is wrong. The global synchronicity is wrong. This is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of evidence. The evidence suggests that millions of children were left parentless by an event far more significant and far more mysterious than the Industrial Revolution. An event that has been quietly omitted from our history. The implications are enormous. If such a recent and transformative cataclysm could be erased from the record, what else in our history is incomplete? What other narratives have we accepted without question? This is not a story from the distant past. The last of the orphan train riders lived well into the 21st century. This is our grandparents' and great-grandparents' world. The evidence is not buried in ancient ruins, it is in the foundations of our own cities. It is in the old, oversized brick buildings that still stand, their original purpose forgotten. It is in the census records with their strange gaps and inconsistencies. It is in the old cemeteries with their sections of small, unnamed graves. The truth is not hidden. It has simply been ignored. We invite you to stop ignoring it. Look at your own local history. Question the simple stories. Count the numbers for yourself. The past is not a settled place, it is an active investigation. And the clues are all around us, waiting for those with the courage to see them for what they are. The numbers are there for anyone to examine. The only real question is why we've been taught not to look. If you believe our history deserves a closer, more honest examination, join us on this investigation. The archive is vast, and there is much more to uncover. Subscribe, and continue to question.